Hi everyone, Happy New Year! Today I'm going to be doing a recap of my favorite books from 2021. This was not actually supposed to be a just science fiction and fantasy list, it's just that I read pretty much fantasy and some science fiction and then a few other things. So this is a fantasy and science fiction list and I'm doing my top 9 because I was kind of looking for a top 10 and there were really only 9 things that I felt like it made sense for me to put on this list. But a few of them are actually series and not books where I read an entire series. So there's actually more than 9 books on this list, but yeah, top 9. This list isn't really going to be in order of preference because I find it quite hard to go through and rank some books that are very different from each other in that way. So I'm just kind of going to go from when in the year I read them. One of my favorite books that I read in 2020 was A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. That book actually ended up winning the Hugo Award that year. The sequel, A Desolation Called Peace, came out in early 2021. I actually reread A Memory Called Empire in preparation for A Desolation Called Peace coming out, and I found I actually really appreciated A Memory Called Empire even more from the reread. A Memory Called Empire is one of those books that I connected to in a very intellectual way, and the first time I read it around some books that were just sort of a little more larger than life. I think I read it after Gideon the Ninth, which is a very sort of funny, over-the-top book, and A Memory Called Empire is kind of a really smart book that has a lot of depth to it, but it's all very internalized. There's a lot to think about. It really is kind of a more modern science fiction of ideas. So A Desolation Called Peace was a really great follow-up. My husband and I both really enjoyed this one. It continued to expand on a lot of the ideas in A Memory Called Empire. It continued the character arc of Mahi, who is the main character from the first book. In the first book, she's really dealing with basically her love for the culture that is conquering her own culture. Then in A Desolation Called Peace, she has to come to terms with the fact that she doesn't really fit in with her own culture anymore either because of the experiences she went through in the first book. She is kind of caught between two worlds. A Desolation Called Peace also introduces some new characters that I really enjoyed the points of view of, including one kid character. Sometimes kid point of views are not great, but this was actually a really interesting look at a young character who is now the heir to an empire and has been through a lot of political maneuvering already in his short life and sort of getting to see things through his very cynical but still childlike perspective. A lot of people probably talked about Piranesi this year. There are several books on this list that I actually read twice this year, and Piranesi is one of those books. I actually never did a review of this book. I'll link to any reviews that I did do for any of the books on this list, but yeah, I feel a little silly about that, especially because it ended up being on the Hugo's short list where I was trying to review or read everything that I hadn't read. Anyway, I loved Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by this author, which came out when I was a teenager, so it had been a very long time since she published a novel. And Piranesi is a completely different book. So if Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell wasn't for you, you might still like Piranesi. It is one of those very short literary books where a lot is left unsaid, and it's more of a kind of a character study, emotional journey as much as a plot. If you are a purely plot reader, this might not be for you, but it was definitely a book that made me feel a lot of things, think about a lot of things. It explores a lot about the nature of identity and memory as well, and it goes beyond magical realism, but it's not a super well-developed world-building fantasy either, but this is definitely the kind of book that I really enjoy. And so I read this once physically, and then I listened to the audiobook a little while later because I watched some reviews of it, and I saw that a lot of people were talking about how good the audiobook performance was. And I agree, I really enjoyed it. I actually thought, based on what everyone was saying, that once I listened to this on audiobook, I would enjoy the book even more. This is a book that kind of grew on me throughout the year. Like, I quite liked it the first time I read it, but sometimes the books that end up leaving the biggest impression are the ones that you just keep thinking about for months afterwards. So for me, that was Piranesi, but I do think while I enjoyed the audiobook, it didn't completely change my perspective on the book, which I have had happen, especially with short books. For me, because I'm quite a fast reader, sometimes I read things too quickly for the emotional impact to have time to sink in, and listening to it can force me to slow down the pace. But in this case, I feel like my impression of reading the book and then listening to it was quite similar, but then it was a book that just really grew on me and stuck with me throughout the year. And I had some really interesting conversations about it. Now we have The Wall of Storms by Ken Liu. This is the second book in the Dandelion Dynasty series. The third book, The Veiled Throne, just came out, and I have read it. I did really like it, but I'm putting The Wall of Storms on this list because The Veiled Throne is really the first half of the final book of the series. It's just a really big first half. So I feel like I didn't have like a complete journey with that one. I can't really rank it or react to it until I see how the series ends. But The Wall of Storms really blew me away. The Grace of Kings is another one of those books that just really like grew with me over time. And what blew me away about The Wall of Storms is that it really develops everything from the first book of the series, but just takes it in such an interesting direction. And it's kind of a totally different book. Even the style feels kind of different. It feels like it's really developing this world. It's really studying the course of history, the way it evolves in this fantasy world. So I got really obsessed with this series this year. I've been promising to make videos about it for a really long time. I still haven't done it, so I'm sorry about that. I do want to. I do love this series, and I think it's highly, highly underrated. Another series I've been kind of obsessed with and really need to finish is The Books of Babel by Josaiah Bancroft. I read both Arm of the Sphinx and Hod King in 2021, and I really enjoyed both of them. For me, Arm of the Sphinx, which was book 2, I didn't enjoy it quite as much as book 1 and book 3, The Hod King, so I'm putting The Hod King on this list as my favorite of this year. I still really need to read book 4. It's on the shelf back there. I just haven't gotten to it yet. But this is another series that I've just been really obsessed with, so I'm kind of putting the entire series on this list, but I didn't read the entire series in 2021. Out of the 2 I read, my favorite was The Hod King. Again, another series that has just really stuck with me. It's really different than most of the fantasy I've read, and I am someone that likes to seek out fantasy that's different. So this series has just been I've just really enjoyed it. Next, I'll talk about a series that I actually started, I think in 2019, and then didn't read any books from in 2020, and then finished up in 2021. That's the Memoirs of Lady Trent. So relatively early on in the year, I reread the first book, which was the only one I had read, A Natural History of Dragons. The series is by Brennan. I don't think I mentioned that. So I actually found the first book to be really, really slow at times, especially because I listened to it on audiobook when the first time I read it, I had read it physically. A lot of times when I reread things, I like to change up the format just to get that different perspective. So in this case, I finished the first book still feeling kind of intrigued by the series, but also I hadn't remembered the book being that slow, and I was a little disappointed by it. But from the second book onwards, the series really, really picked up for me. I thought it was just such a wonderful character study of the main character, Lady Trent. It's written in this perspective where she's writing it. It's her memoirs as an older lady, and she's looking back on her life. And so it has this really interesting arc where you see her grow from a teenager, really, in the first book through, I think in her 40s, probably, in the last book in the main series. And I really appreciated how Brennan showed that arc, showed her grow up, and how this character, where her driving passion was always science and knowledge and exploration, but the way that she became a more complete person as she got older and learned to balance things, balance her impulsiveness, make better decisions, and become a really established scholar. I really enjoyed reading all of that. And it was also interesting to me because I know, now that I'm in my 30s, I connected to the character in a really different way and in different books and at different times in her life than I would have if I had read this book when I was a teenager. And it made me think about all the times now where I read things with young characters and just think they're so stupid, where if I read the book when I was the same age as those characters, everything would have seemed totally reasonable that they were doing. So that has given me a lot more appreciation for authors and how they capture what it's like to, be different ages. A series that I just adored in 2021 was the Penric and Desdemona series by Lois, McMaster, Bujold. Bujold has been one of my favorite authors for probably well over a decade at this point. The Vorkosigan saga, which I have done a video about, is one of my favorite, maybe my favorite series of all time. Something about Bujold, she just writes characters that you just fall in love with, and they're just so colorful, and they just, I don't know, they just sneak into your heart and stay there. So I'm pretty sure I have a series review up of the Penric and Desdemona books, so I won't talk about it too much right now. I hesitated on reading these for a long time because they are all novellas, except for the most recent one that was published, I think. So I kind of just hadn't even tried the series just because of the length. But honestly, as much as I still don't really like novellas, these really just felt like mini Bujold books, like the way she plots and does character arcs and things. This is another series that traces a character from a teenager to, being adult. This is another series that traces a character from being a teenager to being an adult with a family, so that was also really interesting. But yeah, check out my review if you want. Check out my review if you want more about this series. But this was honestly just such a comfort read for me this year. All of these books just felt, I don't know, I felt really happy reading them, and just, I needed that. Another series of mostly novellas that I finally got around to and really loved was Murderbot. Here's Network Effect, which is the only full-length novel in the series, which won the Hugo Award for Best Novel this year. Yay! But I did read the entire series this year, and this is another one that was, I guess, not as much of a comfort read as Penric, but I just fell in love with multiple characters in this series, and just, I know I'll probably revisit this series a lot of times. It really is a new favorite just in terms of my sort of emotional attachment and connection to it. So a lot of people had told me before I read it that this was going to be something I would like, and they were very correct. The tone and the humor and the character were all things that I was very drawn to and enjoyed a lot. Another book that I read twice in 2021, once physically and once an audiobook, was Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This was really fun. The Martian is one of my favorite books, just in terms of pure, fun and how engaged I feel while reading it. And Project Hail Mary was honestly quite similar to The Martian. Some people think maybe a little too similar, but I really enjoyed it. There were a lot of things that just made it super enjoyable to read. I think Andy Weir writes sort of kind of optimistic, terrible scenarios, things where it looks hopeless, but there's like this relentless optimism about humanity and the future of humanity. And I probably kind of needed that too this year. The reason I listened to it after reading it was because I got very engaged in the overall plot and emotional arc of the character, and I kind of skimmed past some of the science, which was kind of, the point of the book the first time I read it. So I listened to it on audiobook, and that made me slow down. And I really enjoyed the science stuff. He's very good at writing scientific concepts in a way that a layperson with only, moderate to minimal interest in actual science can still enjoy how it connects into the plot. This was a really fun one for me this year, and I had been looking forward to it, and it didn't disappoint. The last book that I'll talk about is one that I was very afraid of being disappointed in, The Witness for the Dead by Katherine Addison. This is a follow-up to The Goblin Emperor, which I first read in 2020, and that's still one of my favorite books of all time. It made such an impression on me. I honestly really want to reread it again soon, because every time, I think even when I was doing a review of Witness for the Dead and I wanted to look something up and I just was looking for something in Goblin Emperor, and I just caught myself half an hour later sitting there reading the book. So Witness for the Dead, I don't love it as much as I love Goblin Emperor, but it was a very good book, and I think a worthy and successful follow-up, which is good, because there was another book that Katherine Addison released in 2020 called Angel of Crows, which, not so much. So thank goodness Witness for the Dead was really enjoyable. I do have a review up of this one, and I'm pretty sure she's actually doing another book about the same character that she follows in this one that's coming out this year, 2022. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm feeling pretty confident about it. And I'm happy that I really enjoyed The Witness for the Dead, that it did have some emotional impact, and that I did really care about the character. Even if I didn't love it as much as Goblin Emperor, I felt like it was a good thing that she published this book, kept writing in this world, that there are more stories to tell, which is great, because I love the world building in this series. So there you have my favorite 9 books and series that I read in 2021. Let me know if you read any of these, if any of them were your favorites, or if not, what your favorites were. And I will try to be back soon with my least favorite and most disappointing books of the year, because I know secretly everyone just loves the negativity and not, the positivity about all the things that I enjoyed.